The first rule they handed Marcus was written in blood-red ink. Do not look directly at passengers wearing yellow raincoats after 11 p.m. The paper trembled in his hands as the ferry's horn echoed across the dark Puget Sound, a sound that seemed to carry something far more sinister than a simple departure warning. Welcome back to another spine-chilling true story from the Pacific Northwest. Before we dive into Marcus's terrifying ferry ride, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? Are you alone? Because after hearing this story, you might want to keep the lights on. If you're brave enough to stay until the end, smash that like button and subscribe for more real horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about late-night travel. The Washington State Ferry had been Marcus's regular commute for 3 years, shuttling between Seattle and Bainbridge Island for his night security job. But on October 13, 2023, something changed. The usual crew was gone, replaced by pale-faced attendants who moved with an unnatural stillness. Their eyes held a hollow emptiness that made Marcus's skin crawl, and when they smiled, their teeth seemed too sharp, too numerous. As passengers filed aboard the aging vessel, each received a folded piece of paper rules that made no logical sense. Marcus watched other travelers read their copies, their faces draining of color before they quickly stuffed the papers into their pockets. Some passengers immediately turned around and walked back off the ferry, abandoning their cars and belongings without explanation. The October wind howled through the terminal, carrying with it the metallic scent of something that wasn't quite rain. Streetlights flickered in patterns that hurt to look at, and in the distance, Marcus could swear he heard children singing a lullaby he'd never heard before, one that seemed to come from beneath the black water itself. He should have left then. Should have listened to the voice in his head screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. Instead, Marcus clutched the strange rules tighter and stepped aboard, sealing his fate with the sound of his footsteps on the metal gangway. The ferry's engines rumbled to life with a sound like grinding bones. 3 hours earlier, Marcus Chen had been having the most ordinary evening of his life. His small Capitol Hill apartment was filled with the comforting sounds of his daily routine, the microwave humming as it heated leftover Chinese takeout, his ancient radiator clanking its familiar rhythm, and the distant murmur of Seattle traffic filtering through rain-streaked windows. At 34, Marcus had settled into the predictable life of a night security guard at a Bainbridge Island data center. The job paid well enough to cover his modest lifestyle, a one-bedroom apartment with a view of a brick wall, a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and enough left over for his weekend hiking trips in the Cascades. He preferred the solitude of night work, fewer people to deal with, more time to read, and a peaceful ferry commute that let him decompress between the city's chaos and the island's serenity. The Fauntleroy ferry terminal had become as familiar as his own living room. He knew every crack in the concrete, every rust stain on the metal railings, every face of the regular night commuters. There was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian, who always carried a thermos of chamomile tea. Jim, the truck driver, who never failed to nod and grunt a greeting. The group of college students who worked late shifts at the island's restaurants always clustered together, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't that funny. Tonight felt different from the moment Marcus parked his car in the terminal lot. The usual attendants, Dave and Maria, who he'd exchanged small talk with for months, were nowhere to be seen. Instead, 3 pale figures in navy blue uniforms stood motionlessly at the gate, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their caps. They didn't chat with passengers or check tickets with the casual efficiency Marcus had grown accustomed to. They simply stood waiting, watching. The terminal building itself seemed changed. Fluorescent lights that had burned bright white for years now cast a sickly yellow glow that made everyone's skin look jaundiced. The waiting area's familiar blue plastic chairs had been rearranged in a perfect circle facing inward, though Marcus couldn't remember anyone moving them. The vending machines hummed at a frequency that set his teeth on edge. Most unsettling of all was the silence among the passengers. The usual chatter about work weather and weekend plans had died completely. People sat apart from each other, staring at their phones or the floor, but Marcus noticed none of the screens seemed to be displaying anything. Just blank black rectangles that reflected their faces like dark mirrors. The ferry itself appeared unchanged as it approached the dock, the same white and green hull, the same practical design meant for utility rather than beauty. But something in the way it moved through the water struck Marcus as wrong. It glided too smoothly without the usual vibration of engines working against the current. The wake behind it formed patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, like something was swimming just beneath the surface, guiding the vessel's path. As boarding began, Marcus noticed that several regular passengers were missing. Mrs. Patterson wasn't there. Neither was Jim. In fact, most of the faces around him belonged to strangers, people he'd never seen before, despite taking this route 5 nights a week for 3 years. The rules were handed out as passengers crossed the threshold onto the ferry deck. Each paper was folded precisely in half, creased with mechanical perfection that suggested machine-like precision rather than human hands. Marcus watched the pale attendant approach him, a woman whose name tag read, Sarah, in cheerful comic sans fond that contrasted grotesquely with her hollow, sunken eyes. "Welcome aboard," Sarah said, her voice carrying an odd echo as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "Please review your passenger guidelines carefully. Compliance ensures a safe journey." Marcus unfolded the paper with growing unease. The letterhead showed the familiar Washington State Ferry logo, but something was off about the design. The colors seemed too bright, almost glowing, and the text below was printed in that same unsettling red ink special. Evening passenger guidelines. Route 447. Do not look directly at passengers wearing yellow raincoats after 11 p.m. If you hear children singing, do not attempt to locate the source. The lower deck restrooms are temporarily out of order. Use facilities on upper deck. Only do not feed the seagulls. They are not seagulls. If your car alarm activates during transit, remain in the passenger area. Report any crew members without name tags to the captain immediately. The snack bar will be closed during the 10:47 p.m. announcement. Do not photograph the water on the port side between 11:15 to 11:23 p.m. if you see your reflection moving independently in any window. Alert crew immediately. Passengers experiencing time lapses should remain calm and seek assistance. Marcus read the list 3 times, each reading making less sense than the last. Route 447. He'd never heard of that designation. His regular ferry was Route 32, running the standard Fauntleroy-Vachon Southworth route. And what did time lapses mean? The rules felt like something from a fever dream, nonsensical, yet written with the authority of official documentation. Around him, other passengers were having similar reactions. A middle-aged man in a business suit crumpled his paper and threw it in a trash bin, but Marcus noticed that within seconds the paper had somehow returned to the man's jacket pocket. A young woman near the bow was frantically texting, but her phone screen remained black despite her urgent tapping. A family with 2 small children had gathered around their copy, the parents whispering urgently, while the children stared with wide, frightened eyes. "Excuse me," Marcus called to Sarah, who was gliding between passengers with that same mechanical precision. "What's Route 447? I thought this was the regular Southworth run." Sarah turned toward him, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. Her face, which had seemed simply pale from a distance, was now clearly visible as something far worse. Her skin had the waxy, artificial quality of a department store mannequin. Her eyes were the wrong color, not blue or brown or green, but a shifting gray that seemed to contain depths that shouldn't exist in human anatomy. "Route 447 is a special service," she replied, her voice maintaining that hollow echo, "for passengers who need to reach alternative destinations." "Alternative destinations? I just need to get to Bainbridge Island for work." "All passengers will reach their intended destination," Sarah said, but something in her tone suggested that what Marcus intended and what he would receive might be very different things. "Please review your guidelines. Compliance ensures a safe journey." The ferry's horn sounded again, 3 long blasts that seemed to resonate not just through the air, but through Marcus's bones. The sound was wrong, too deep, lasting too long, carrying harmonics that human ears weren't meant to process. Several passengers covered their ears, and Marcus noticed that one elderly man near the stern had begun bleeding from his nose. As the vessel pulled away from the dock, Marcus tried to get his bearings. The familiar lights of West Seattle should have been visible off the starboard side, but instead there was only darkness. Not the natural darkness of night, but an absolute void that seemed to swallow light itself. The water around the ferry had taken on an oily quality, reflecting the deck lights in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The other passengers had begun to disperse throughout the ferry, but their movements seemed choreographed, as if they were following invisible pathways marked on the deck. Marcus noticed that despite having boarded what appeared to be a standard auto ferry, he couldn't see any cars. The lower deck, which should have been filled with vehicles, was simply absent. Looking down through the metal grating, he saw only more darkness. A young man brushed past Marcus, muttering under his breath, "This isn't right. This isn't the right ferry. I need to get off." He hurried toward the stern, presumably looking for crew members, but Marcus watched him disappear around a corner and somehow never emerge on the other side. It was as if the ferry had simply swallowed him. The rules in Marcus's hand seemed to grow heavier, the red ink appearing to pulse with its own light. He looked around desperately for some sign of normalcy, some indication that this was all a misunderstanding or an elaborate prank. Instead, he saw a clock mounted on the bulkhead that read 11:47 p.m. Though he was certain it had been just past 8 p.m. when he'd boarded, time wasn't behaving properly. That's when he saw the first passenger in a yellow raincoat. The figure stood at the bow, motionless, facing out toward the impossible darkness. The raincoat was the bright artificial yellow of a traffic cone, so vivid it seemed to glow against the night. Marcus remembered rule number 1 and quickly averted his eyes, but not before noticing that the figure cast no reflection in the nearby windows. The ferry's engine settled into a rhythm that sounded less like machinery and more like breathing deep, steady inhalations and exhalations that made the deck vibrate beneath Marcus's feet. Somewhere in the distance, just at the edge of hearing, children began to sing. The children's song drifted across the water like fog, wordless but hauntingly familiar. As if Marcus had heard it in dreams he'd forgotten upon waking. He forced himself to remember rule number 2, do not attempt to locate the source. But the melody seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, sometimes from the lower deck that shouldn't exist, sometimes from the dark water itself, sometimes from inside his own head. Marcus made his way to the passenger lounge, hoping to find answers, or at least other confused travelers. The space that should have been filled with the standard ferry amenities, plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a small snack bar, windows offering views of the Sound, had been transformed into something else entirely. The chairs were still there, but they were arranged in that same ritualistic circle he'd noticed in the terminal. The snack bar stood empty, its metal grates pulled down, though he could swear he heard the sound of coffee brewing and conversations coming from behind the barriers. 3 passengers sat in the circular arrangement, each staring at the center point where nothing visible existed. Marcus approached cautiously, recognizing one of them, a woman who'd been on his regular commute for months, though he'd never learned her name. She wore the same brown coat, carried the same leather purse, but her face had taken on that same waxy, artificial quality as the crew members. "Excuse me," Marcus said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you feeling all right?" She turned toward him with movements that were too smooth, too fluid, like a camera panning rather than a human head turning. Her eyes held recognition, but also something else, a warning or perhaps an apology. "You shouldn't have boarded tonight," she said, her voice carrying the same hollow echo as the crew. "Some of us didn't have a choice anymore. But you could have walked away." "What do you mean? What's happening here?" Before she could respond, the ferry's intercom crackled to life with a voice that sounded like static shaped into words. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now approaching the deeper waters. All passengers, please note that we will be crossing the boundary at 11:23 p.m. Photography of the port side is strictly prohibited during this time as per your passenger guidelines." Marcus checked his watch, 11:22 p.m. He looked around frantically for a clock to confirm, but every timepiece he could see displayed a different hour. Some showed times that hadn't happened yet, others showed impossible readings like 25:30 or 88:15. The announcement continued, "Passengers experiencing temporal displacement should remain calm. This is a normal part of the journey to your alternative destinations. Please ensure you are not looking directly at any passengers in yellow raincoats, as doing so may result in permanent integration into the crew." Integration into the crew. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach as he began to understand what had happened to the familiar faces that were missing tonight. Dave and Maria, the regular attendants. Mrs. Patterson with her thermos of tea. Jim, the truck driver. They hadn't quit or been reassigned, they had become part of whatever this ferry had transformed into. A movement caught his peripheral vision. Another figure in a yellow raincoat had appeared, this one standing near the port side windows. The prohibition against photographing that area suddenly made terrible sense. Marcus kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, but he could feel the figure's attention pressing against him like a physical weight. The woman in the brown coat leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more urgency than a shout. "They collect passengers one route at a time. This ferry, it doesn't go to regular destinations anymore. It goes to places that exist in the spaces between places, and everyone who rides it becomes part of its crew eventually." "How do I get off?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You don't. But if you are very careful, if you follow every rule exactly, you might delay the inevitable. Some passengers have hidden in the spaces that don't fully exist yet, between decks and maintenance areas that are still partially real." As if summoned by their conversation, one of the pale crew members appeared at Marcus's shoulder. This one's name tag read Dave, and Marcus recognized the uniform, the stance, even the face, but distorted like looking at someone through rippling water. "Sir, you'll need to take your assigned seat for the transition," Dave said. "We're entering unstable waters." Marcus wanted to run, but where could he go on a ferry surrounded by impossible darkness? Instead, he nodded and allowed Dave to guide him to a chair that hadn't been there moments before. As he sat, he felt the metal beneath him pulse with the same breathing rhythm as the engines. The view from the windows had changed completely. Instead of the familiar lights of Puget Sound communities, Marcus saw landscapes that defied physics. Forests grew upside down from the sky, their roots reaching toward the water. Islands floated in midair, connected by bridges made of what looked like crystallized moonlight. In the distance, a city burned with flames that cast no light, its skyline twisting into impossible geometries. Other passengers were pointing and murmuring, but their voices seemed to come from far away, as if everyone was speaking through thick glass. Marcus noticed that his own reflection in the window was beginning to lag behind his movements. When he raised his hand, the reflection took several seconds to follow suit. The children's song grew louder, and now Marcus could make out some of the words, though they were in a language he didn't recognize. The melody was beautiful and terrible, and he found himself humming along before catching himself and clamping his mouth shut. Around him, other passengers were swaying to the rhythm, their eyes vacant, their movements synchronized. A new announcement. "Attention passengers, the snack bar is now closing for the 10:47 p.m. service interruption. Any passengers currently in the lower deck restroom should evacuate immediately. This is not a drill." Marcus looked at his watch, 10:46 p.m. But that was impossible. It had been after 11 p.m. just minutes ago. Time was folding in on itself, and with growing horror, he realized that the ferry was traveling not just through space, but through temporal loops. Each cycle, the rules changed slightly. Each cycle, more passengers disappeared or transformed. He pulled out his phone to call for help, but the screen showed only his reflection staring back at him, and his reflection was smiling even though Marcus definitely was not. He threw the phone aside and heard it clatter somewhere beneath the deck in a space that geometrically shouldn't exist. The figure in the yellow raincoat was closer now. Even with his eyes averted, Marcus could sense its presence like heat from a fire. His vision began to blur at the edges, and he understood with crystalline clarity that looking directly at it would be the last autonomous decision he ever made. In the distance, new passengers were boarding the ferry, but they were boarding at a dock that floated in midair, connected to nothing, populated by people whose movements were too fluid and whose eyes reflected light, like an animal's. Marcus realized with mounting terror that the ferry didn't have a single route. It had infinite routes connecting places that existed only in the margins of reality, and it collected passengers from all of them. The woman in the brown coat appeared beside him again, her transformation more advanced now. Her fingers had grown too long and her skin had taken on the translucent quality of ice. "The maintenance areas," she whispered urgently. "Below the main deck, but not in the lower deck. The spaces that are still becoming. If you can find them before the next temporal loop, you might be able to hide until..." She trailed off, her expression becoming vacant. Until what? But she was already walking away, her movements now matching the synchronized rhythm of the crew members. Soon, there would be no difference between them. The maintenance doors should not have existed. According to every ferry design Marcus had ever seen, the narrow corridor behind the passenger lounge led only to emergency equipment and crew quarters. But as the temporal loops intensified and reality began to fracture more severely, new spaces had started appearing, areas that existed in the gaps between the ferry's original architecture and whatever it was becoming. Marcus squeezed through the door marked, "Authorized personnel only," just as another announcement echoed through the ship. "All passengers, please prepare for final integration. The ferry will be docking at Terminal 0 in approximately never minutes. Thank you for choosing alternative transit services." The corridor beyond was impossible. It stretched much farther than the ferry's physical dimensions could contain, lit by fluorescent lights that flickered in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code. The walls were lined with photographs in cheap plastic frames, and as Marcus moved deeper into the passage, he realized they were pictures of every passenger who had ever ridden this route. Thousands of faces stared out from the frames, their expressions shifting from confusion to terror to the same vacant acceptance he'd seen on the woman in the brown coat. At the far end of the corridor, which should have opened onto the Sound but instead revealed another impossibility, Marcus found a maintenance room that hummed with machinery he didn't recognize. Banks of monitors showed feeds from dozens of different ferry routes, all of them wrong, all of them carrying passengers to destinations that shouldn't exist. He saw ferries crossing seas of stars, vessels sailing through clouds, ships navigating rivers of liquid light. But on the central monitor, he saw something that made his blood freeze. His own apartment in Capitol Hill, viewed from an impossible angle that seemed to look down from the ceiling and up from the floor simultaneously. A figure sat at his kitchen table, pale, wearing a ferry crew uniform with a name tag that read, Marcus. The figure was opening his mail, eating his leftover Chinese food, living his life with mechanical precision. "Integration is nearly complete," a voice said behind him. Marcus spun around to face what had once been Dave, the regular ferry attendant. But Dave's transformation was more advanced now. His skin had become translucent, revealing a network of black veins beneath, and his eyes had been replaced by swirling voids that seemed to contain entire galaxies. "Every route needs its crew," Dave continued, his voice harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "And every crew member gets to keep living their old life in a fashion. The replacement handles the mundane details while the real you serves a higher purpose." "What purpose?" Marcus demanded, backing against the monitor bank. "What is this ferry? Where does it really go?" Dave's smile revealed teeth like broken glass. "Everywhere. Nowhere. The ferry exists to connect the spaces between spaces, to carry passengers who have slipped through the cracks of reality. Some board willingly, seeking escape from lives they can no longer bear. Others, like you, board by accident when the boundaries thin and the routes overlap with ordinary transportation." The monitors around Marcus flickered, showing more impossible destinations: a hospital where all the patients floated 3 feet above their beds, a shopping mall built inside the hollow trunk of a tree larger than mountains, a library where the books screamed when opened. Each location was served by its own version of the ferry, crewed by people who had once been ordinary passengers. "The best part," Dave said, moving closer with that fluid, inhuman gait, "is that nobody in your old life will ever know you're gone. Your replacement will be perfect, same memories, same habits, same personality, only better, more efficient, more compliant." Marcus lunged for the door, but it had vanished, leaving only blank wall behind him. The maintenance room was sealing itself, reality rearranging to trap him. Through the monitors, he could see the other passengers on the upper deck standing in perfect formation. Now their movements synchronized, their faces bearing the same peaceful vacancy of the fully integrated. "Don't fight it," Dave advised, extending a hand that had too many joints in the wrong places. "The process is so much easier if you don't fight it. Just let the ferry become part of you, and you become part of the ferry. You'll still exist in a way. You'll just exist in service to something larger than yourself." The children's song reached a crescendo, and Marcus realized that the voices belonged to passengers who had been transformed long ago, their consciousness absorbed into the ferry's collective, their individual selves dissolved into the harmony of the ship's eternal song. Soon, his voice would join theirs wordlessly singing travelers to their alternative destinations. But as Dave reached for him, Marcus noticed something crucial. His reflection in the monitor screens was still lagging behind his movements, still showing signs of temporal displacement. He wasn't fully integrated yet. The loops weren't complete. With desperate clarity, he remembered the rules, all of them, and he understood that they weren't just warnings, they were instructions for survival written by previous passengers who had found ways to delay or escape the integration process. Marcus grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and smashed the central monitor, the one showing his replacement living his life. Sparks flew, alarms blared, and the room filled with the smell of burning circuits. Dave shrieked a sound like metal tearing and stumbled backward as the integrated passengers throughout the ferry began to convulse. "You can't stop the integration," Dave howled. "The ferry needs its crew." But Marcus was already running through a maintenance hatch that had suddenly appeared, crawling through spaces that existed only because the ferry's reality was temporarily disrupted. The disruption caused by destroying the central monitor created pockets of instability throughout the ferry, moments where the original vessel's mundane reality reasserted itself over the supernatural transformation. Marcus crawled through maintenance tunnels that flickered between existing and not existing, following the sound of normal ferry engines mixed with the otherworldly breathing rhythm that had taken over the ship. He emerged onto what appeared to be the regular car deck, complete with familiar rows of vehicles and the normal smell of salt air and diesel exhaust. For a moment, hope flooded through him as he saw his own Honda Civic parked exactly where he'd left it. But as he approached, he noticed that the license plate numbers were shifting, rearranging themselves into patterns that spelled out messages "Welcome home," became "No escape," became "Join us," in an endless cycle. The other cars were occupied by their owners, all sitting perfectly still behind their steering wheels, staring straight ahead with the same vacant expression Marcus had seen throughout the ferry. Their car radios played the children's song in unison, creating a harmony that made his teeth ache. Through the car deck windows, Marcus could see that they were approaching something that might have been a dock. But instead of the familiar terminal structure, twisted metal pylons reached up from black water, supporting a platform that seemed to be constructed from the bones of massive sea creatures. Figures in yellow raincoats stood waiting perfectly motionless, ready to welcome new passengers aboard. The ferry's intercom crackled one final time. "Now arriving at your alternative destination. Please remain in your vehicles until the crew gives the all clear. Welcome to Terminal 0, where every journey begins again." Marcus felt the pull, then a gentle but insistent force drawing him toward his car, toward the seat behind the steering wheel where he belonged, where he could sit quietly and wait for instructions from the crew. It would be so easy to give in, to let the ferry's artificial peace wash over him. His replacement was already living his life better than he ever had. What was the point of struggling? But something in him rebelled against that artificial tranquility. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was the last flicker of human free will. But Marcus turned away from his car and ran toward the stern of the ferry. If this vessel traveled between impossible destinations, perhaps there was still a way to reach an ordinary one. The crew members were converging on his location now, moving with inhuman speed through the spaces between cars. Their pale faces reflected the sickly light of Terminal 0 as they closed in, ready to complete his integration. Marcus reached the ferry's rear railing just as the vessel bumped against the dock. The black water below looked infinite hungry, but it was the only direction the crew wasn't approaching from. Marcus jumped. The black water was shockingly cold and tasted of copper and forgotten dreams. He sank deep, the ferry's unnatural lights growing dim above him, the crew's shrieks of frustration muffled by the dark waves. His lungs burned as he swam desperately away from Terminal 0 toward what he hoped was open water. When he finally surfaced, gasping and choking, the ferry was gone. In its place, he saw the familiar lights of the regular Washington State Ferry terminal and a normal vessel, the MV Kaliton, approaching the dock with mundane mechanical reliability. Marcus treaded water disoriented as he watched ordinary passengers disembarking, heading to their cars with the casual efficiency of people completing a routine commute. He swam toward shore, his waterlogged clothes dragging him down, his mind reeling with the impossibility of what he'd experienced. By the time he reached the rocky beach near the terminal, the last passengers had driven away, and the area was empty except for a security guard making his rounds. "Hey, you all right?" the guard called out, shining his flashlight on Marcus's soaked form. "What happened?" "You fall off a boat." Marcus opened his mouth to explain about the alternative ferry, the strange rules the crew that collected passengers for impossible destinations. But looking at the guard's concerned, entirely normal face, the words wouldn't come. How could he possibly make anyone believe what he'd experienced? "Yeah," he said instead. "Fell off a boat. Can I call a cab?" The ride home passed in a blur of familiar Seattle streets and ordinary radio chatter. Marcus sat in the back seat shivering despite the heater, trying to convince himself that it had all been some kind of hallucination. Maybe he'd had a breakdown or fallen asleep in the terminal and dreamed the entire terrifying sequence. But when he reached his apartment building on Capitol Hill, he stopped dead on the sidewalk. Through his kitchen window on the 3rd floor, he could see a figure moving around, someone wearing his clothes, using his coffee maker, living his life with mechanical precision. The replacement was already in place, just as Dave had promised. Marcus backed away from the building, his heart hammering against his ribs. If his replacement was already there, then what did that make him? Was he real? Was he the copy? Had the integration process worked differently than he'd thought? He fumbled for his phone, then remembered he'd thrown it away on the ferry. But there was a payphone outside the corner store, an ancient relic that somehow still worked. With trembling fingers, he dialed his own number. The voice that answered was his own, but flatter, more efficient. "Hello, who is this?" Marcus whispered. "This is Marcus Chen. Who is this?" I'm Marcus Chen too." A pause. Then, "I see. You're the original. I wondered when you'd call. What are you?" "I'm you, but better. I don't question orders. I don't experience unnecessary anxiety. I work my security job without wondering if there's something more to life. The ferry provided your employers with an improved version." Marcus felt reality tilt around him. "But I escaped. I got away from the ferry." "Did you?" The replacement's voice carried a note of artificial sympathy. "Or are you exactly where they want you to be, living on the margins, knowing the truth, but unable to prove it, replaced by someone who serves their purposes better?" Through the phone, Marcus could hear the faint sound of children singing that wordless, haunting melody. "The ferry runs every night," his replacement continued, "and there are so many people who could benefit from improvement. Thank you for your service, Marcus. You've helped us understand human resistance patterns much better." The line went dead. Marcus stood in the rain outside his own apartment building, watching his replacement live his life, understanding with crystalline horror that his escape had never been escape at all. He had become something else entirely. A scout, a researcher, a living advertisement for the ferry's services. In the distance, he could hear the deep, resonant horn of a ferry crossing the dark waters of Puget Sound, carrying new passengers to their alternative destinations.